All right, we are going to track through the end of the Cold War in this section. Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. March 5th, 1953, dictator Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union died. More moderate Soviet leaders came to power after Stalin's death. They allowed satellite countries somewhat more independence, as long as they remained loyal to the Soviet Union. During the 1950s and 1960s, however, growing protest movements in Eastern Europe challenged Soviets' control. De-Stalinization and protest. After Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the dominant Soviet leader. In 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin for jailing and killing Soviet citizens. This was the start of the policy called de-Stalinization, or the purging the country of Stalin's memory. Workers destroyed monuments of Stalin. Khrushchev called for peaceful competition with capitalist states. Soviet satellites were still not happy. In 1956, the Hungarian army joined protesters to overthrow Hungary's Soviet-controlled government. A popular Hungarian communist leader named Imre Nagy formed a new government. Nagy promised free elections and demanded Soviet troops leave Hungary. In response, Soviets attacked Budapest, the capital. Thousands of Hungarian freedom fighters armed themselves with pistols and bottles, but they didn't have a chance. A pro-Soviet government was installed, and Nagy was eventually executed. The revolt in Czechoslovakia. After Nikita Khrushchev's resign, the next Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, crushed any dissent in the empire. He enforced laws limiting basic human rights, like freedom of speech and worship. Government censors controlled what writers could publish, and Brezhnev arrested those who dared protest his policies. Brezhnev didn't allow any dissent from Soviet satellite nations either. In 1968, Czechoslovakian communist leader Alexander Dubček loosened controls on censorship. This period of reform, when Czechoslovakia's capital bloomed with new ideas, became known as the Prague Spring. But it didn't survive the summer. Armed forces from the Warsaw Pact nations invaded Czechoslovakia. Brezhnev justified this invasion by claiming the Soviet Union had the right to prevent its satellites from rejecting communism, a policy known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. From brinkmanship to détente. In the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union finally backed away from the aggressive policies of brinkmanship that they had followed during the early post-war years. The superpowers slowly moved to lower tensions. Brinksmanship breaks down. The brinkmanship policy followed during the presidencies of Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson led to one terrifying crisis after another. Though these crises erupted all over the world, they were united by a common fear. Nuclear war seemed possible. During the administration of John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis made the superpowers' use of nuclear weapons a real possibility. The crisis ended when Soviet ships turned back to avoid a confrontation at sea. But tensions remained high. After the assassination of Kennedy in 1963, Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency. Committed to stopping the spread of communism, President Johnson escalated U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam. The United States turns to détente. Widespread popular protests tore the United States during the Vietnam War, and the turmoil did not end with the U.S. withdrawal. The United States backed away from its policy of direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. Détente, a policy of lessening Cold War tensions, replaced brinksmanship under Richard M. Nixon. President Nixon's move toward détente grew out of a philosophy known as Realpolitik. This term comes from the German word meaning realistic politics. In practice, Realpolitik meant dealing with other nations in a practical and flexible manner. While the United States continued to try to contain the spread of communism, the two superpowers agreed to pursue détente and to reduce tensions. Nixon visits communist powers. Nixon's new policy represented a personal reversal as well as a political shift for the country. His rise in politics in the 1950s was largely due to his strong anti-communist position. 20 years later, he became the first U.S. president to visit communist China. The visit made sense in a world in which three, not just two, superpowers eyed each other suspiciously. "We want the Japanese with us when we sit down and negotiate with the Russians," Nixon explained. 3 months after visiting Beijing in February 1972, Nixon visited the Soviet Union. After a series of meetings called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the SALT I Treaty. This 5-year agreement limited to 1972 levels the number of intercontinental ballistic and submarine-launched missiles each country could have. In 1975, 33 nations joined the United States and the Soviet Union in signing a commitment to détente and cooperation, known as the Helsinki Accords.
I, Richard Milhous Nixon, do solemnly swear.
By the time Richard Nixon reached the White House in 1969, the Cold War had been underway for more than 2 decades. The superpowers had reached a crossroads. They could continue the saber-rattling and confrontations that threatened to plunge the world into nuclear war. Or they could agree to disagree and seek areas of mutual interest. In 1969, they chose the latter, and a decade of relative calm in the Cold War began. In Europe, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt called it Ostpolitik. In the United States, Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger called it détente. It did not end the Cold War, but it created a framework for cooperation among the rivals. In 1972, President Nixon embarked on a diplomatic trip that came to symbolize détente. When he touched down at Capitol Airport near Peking, Nixon became the first American president to be welcomed in the Communist People's Republic of China. It was a historic opening in the Cold War. During a week of diplomacy and cultural exchange, 2 former enemies made great progress toward normalizing relations. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union reached out to the West as well. Chairman Leonid Brezhnev saw détente as an opportunity to gain access to valuable foreign aid and open its borders to international trade. In May 1972, the Kremlin in Moscow played host to the American president. Together, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the first-ever agreements to limit nuclear weapons. The SALT I and ABM treaties were largely symbolic, but they represented a mutual effort to work towards cooperation and coexistence. President Nixon appealed to the Soviet people and their leaders.
Dobry večer. As we look at the prospects for peace, we see that we have made significant progress at reducing the possible sources of direct conflict between us. But history tells us that great nations have often been dragged into war without intending it by conflicts between smaller nations. As great powers, we can and should use our influence to prevent this from happening. Our goal should be to discourage aggression in other parts of the world and particularly among those smaller nations that look to us for leadership and example. With great power goes great responsibility.
Reagan takes an anti-communist stance. A fiercely anti-communist U.S. president, Ronald Reagan, took office in 1981. He continued to move away from détente. He increased defense spending, putting both economic and military pressure on the Soviets. In 1983, Reagan also announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, a program to protect against enemy missiles. It was not put into effect, but remained a symbol of U.S. anti-communist sentiment. President Reagan also helped push the United States and Soviet Union further from détente by increasing defense spending and critically speaking about the Soviet Union. However, the change in Soviet leadership in 1985 brought a new policy toward the United States and the beginnings of a final thaw in the Cold War. The Cold War ends. Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54, Mikhail Gorbachev was the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin. He took power in 1985. Unlike other Soviet leaders, Gorbachev decided to pursue new ideas. The first, glasnost. Past Soviet leaders had created a totalitarian state. It rewarded silence and discouraged individuals from acting on their own. As a result, Soviet society rarely changed, and the Soviet economy stagnated. Gorbachev realized that economic and social reforms could not occur without a free flow of ideas and information. In 1985, he announced a policy known as glasnost, or openness. Glasnost brought huge changes. The government allowed churches to open. It released dissidents from prison and allowed the publication of books by previously banned authors. Reporters investigated problems and criticized officials. The new openness allowed Soviet citizens to complain about economic problems. Consumers protested that they had to stand in line to buy food and other basics. So glasnost, openness. The second, perestroika. Gorbachev blamed these problems on the Soviet Union's inefficient system of central planning. Under central planning, party officials told farm and factory managers how much to produce. They also told them what wages to pay and what prices to charge. Because individuals could not increase their pay by producing more, they had little motive to improve efficiency, and there was no competition. In 1985, Gorbachev introduced the idea of perestroika, or economic restructuring. In 1986, he made changes to revive the Soviet economy. Local managers gained greater authority over their farms and factories, and people were allowed to open small private businesses. Gorbachev's goal was not to throw out communism, but to make the economic system more efficient and productive. The Soviet reforms of the late 1980s inspired Soviet satellite countries in Eastern Europe. For the first time in decades, they were free to make choices about the economic and political systems governing their lives. Mikhail Gorbachev's new thinking in the Soviet Union led him to urge those satellite nation leaders to open up their economic and political systems. Poland and Hungary were among the first countries in Eastern Europe to abandon communism. In 1980, Polish workers at the shipyard went on strike, demanding the government recognize their union, called Solidarity. Millions of Poles supported them, and the government gave in to the union's demands. Union leadership, under Lech Walesa, became a national hero. Hungary. Inspired by the changes in Poland, Hungarian leaders began to reform. To stimulate their economy, reformers encouraged private businesses. A new constitution permitted a multi-party system with free elections. No longer was the Communist Party the only party the people could vote for. In 1990, in national elections, the nation's voters put a non-communist government in power.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Fall of the Berlin Wall. In June of 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan made a speech at the site of the Berlin Wall. The wall had divided the city of Berlin by a free and democratic West and a communist East. It had divided a people since 1961. Reagan's speech defiantly ordered Gorbachev to tear down this wall. East Germany had already begun demanding free elections. 2 years later, the wall fell. 1 year after that, in 1990, Germany reunified after 45 years of being divided after World War II.
All over Eastern Europe that summer, democracy movements were gathering strength. Poland was gearing up for free elections. It was happening in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and behind the walls in East Germany there were pro-democracy demonstrations. People were demanding change. On November the 9th, the East German government finally gave in to the pressure.
You wanted to see what's really behind the wall. What have they been hiding over there? And it's just people on the other side, waiting to see loved ones.
The Berlin Wall was breached. The Iron Curtain had been lifted. The hopes for freedom kindled by Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union proved mightier than walls.
We were crying, watching them tear down this thing that had haunted them for so long. And I remember thinking, what joy, you know, because you could just feel it coming through the television on these people. And I thought, man, that's what it's all about, you know, conquering your ghosts.
Having gone into war to prevent the spread of communism, and now, a decade and a half later, the wall comes down, it causes you to stop, it caused me to stop and think, wow, this sacrifice that people made, 58,000 in Vietnam, I don't know the statistics from Korea. I think they made a contribution. It would be too heartbreaking to think that they didn't.
Conservative Soviet communist leaders opposed Gorbachev's reform. They were furious that Gorbachev had weakened the Soviet Union and its influence in Eastern Europe. They also feared losing their power and privileges. These officials vowed to overthrow Gorbachev and undo his reforms. The August Coup. On August 18, 1991, the hardliners detained Gorbachev at his vacation home on the Black Sea. They demanded his resignation as Soviet president. Early the next day, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles rolled into Moscow. However, the Soviet people had lost their fear of the party. They were willing to defend their freedoms. Protesters gathered at the Russian Parliament building, where the Russian Federation's first directly elected president, Boris Yeltsin, had his office. Around midday, Yeltsin emerged and climbed atop one of the tanks. As his supporters cheered, Yeltsin declared, "We proclaim all decisions and decrees of this committee to be illegal. We appeal to the citizens of Russia. to demand a return of the country to normal constitutional developments. On August 20, the hardliners ordered troops to attack the Parliament building, but they refused. Their refusal turned the tide. On August 21st, the military withdrew its forces from Moscow. That night, Gorbachev returned to Moscow. One by one, the Confederate States withdrew from the Union. Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the party. The Communist Party and the USSR was dead, and the Cold War was officially over.